15 years. That's how long I built a life with David. 15 years of trust. 15 years of partnership. 15 years of believing we were creating something together. Then David decided it was over. And David took everything: the house we bought together, the savings we accumulated, the retirement accounts we invested in. Everything we built, David systematically dismantled it and took it. I was left with nothing: empty hands, empty bank account, empty future. But David missed one thing. The one thing David overlooked while dividing our assets became the most valuable thing I've ever owned. And that one thing changed everything. This is my story. My name is Alicia. I met David at a real estate conference when I was 19 years old. David was 20. We were both the kind of ambitious that comes from wanting more than what we were raised with. David was charming. David was smart. David had plans. We built a life together, not overnight, slowly, carefully. We saved money, we invested. We bought our first house at 24. We got married. We added to our investments. We traveled. We built retirement accounts. We created a future. For 15 years, David was my partner in everything. David made decisions with me. David consulted me. David and I were a team. I believed in David completely. I trusted David with my future, my finances, my heart. I thought David felt the same way about me. The first sign was small. David started working late. Not occasionally, regularly. David would come home and be distant, distracted. David would take calls in the other room and speak quietly when I tried to listen. I asked David what was going on. David said work was stressful. David said a big deal was falling through. David said he was fine. I believed David. But my best friend Maya could see something I couldn't. Maya noticed that David barely touched me anymore. Maya noticed that David looked at his phone constantly. Maya asked me directly, "Alicia, is David having an affair?" I laughed at Maya. I told Maya that was ridiculous. David would never. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to David, listening to David breathe, and something inside me knew. Something told me that David was lying. I just didn't want to know the truth. David left me on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. David just said he was done. David said he didn't love me anymore. David said he'd already talked to a lawyer. I didn't even cry. I was too shocked. Then I hired my own lawyer, and my lawyer told me what David had been doing while David was working late. David had been moving money, not obviously, carefully. David had transferred funds to accounts in David's name only. David had liquidated investments. David had hidden assets. David had been planning this. My lawyer told me that David had essentially dismantled our financial life and moved it beyond my reach. "How is that legal?" I asked, my voice shaking. My lawyer said, "It's not, but it's effective. David got ahead of this. The house, we lost it. The retirement accounts, David had claimed them first. The investment portfolio we'd built together, David had moved it. The savings account I'd spent years building, David had taken it. I walked out of that lawyer's office with nothing. No house, no savings, no future I could see. I was 34 years old and I was starting from zero. I moved back into my mother's house. My mother didn't hesitate. My mother took me in without judgment and gave me a room and a safe place to fall. But I was broken, not just financially, broken completely. I had no job that paid enough to get my own place. I had no savings to rebuild. I had no retirement to fall back on. Everything I'd built was gone. And more than that, I felt stupid. I felt like I'd been blind. I felt like I'd failed at the one thing I thought I was good at: building a life, being a partner, seeing the person I loved clearly. I spent weeks in my mother's guest room, not wanting to see anyone, not wanting anyone to see me. My friends offered money, my family offered loans. I was too proud to take them. I felt like I had failed at life. One night, I sat in that guest room and I actually thought, what do I even have left? What is there to come back from? And I had no answer. My mother convinced me to see a therapist. I didn't want to go. I thought therapy was for people with real problems. But as I sat in that therapist's office, describing the loss of everything material, my therapist asked me something that stopped me cold. Alicia, when you list everything David took from you, the house, the money, the investments, what are you actually grieving? I didn't understand the question. I started listing the material losses again. My therapist interrupted gently. Those are things, but what else did you lose? And I broke. I realized I wasn't grieving the house. I was grieving the future I'd imagined. I was grieving the trust I'd given David. I was grieving 15 years of believing in something that was a lie. I was grieving the person I thought I was, someone who could see people clearly, someone who was a good judge of character, someone who deserved partnership and honesty. My therapist listened and then asked, and what did David miss? In all of his taking, what did David not take? I sat with that question for a long time, and the answer, when it came, changed everything. I went back through my life. I thought about what I'd actually built, not the house David took, not the money David took, but what I'd built in myself. David took the house, but David couldn't take the skills I'd learned in buying it. David took the retirement accounts, but David couldn't take the discipline I'd learned in building them. David took the investments, but David couldn't take the knowledge of how investments work. David took the money, but David couldn't take the work ethic that made that money. And then I realized something else. David couldn't take the relationships that had sustained me, my mother, my best friend Maya, the therapist who was guiding me, the people who showed up for me when I had nothing. They couldn't be taken or divided or liquidated. David couldn't take my resilience, my ability to survive, my capacity to rebuild. David couldn't take the woman I was becoming by walking through this devastation. And then I understood what my therapist meant, what David missed in his taking. David missed me, the real me, the core of who I actually am, separate from the material things we'd accumulated. I called Maya and asked her to meet me at our favorite cafe. When Maya got there, I had something with me. I'd started writing, not journaling, writing, actually writing out my story. Not the story of how David betrayed me, but the story of who I was becoming through the betrayal. I read parts of it to Maya, and Maya cried. Not sad tears, proud tears. Do you see what you've done? Maya asked me. Do you see who you are without David? Do you see what David actually couldn't touch? And in that moment, sitting in a cafe with my best friend, I understood. David took everything material, but David couldn't take my voice. David couldn't take my story. David couldn't take my ability to survive and rebuild and become something stronger than I was before. David couldn't take my capacity to learn, to grow, to understand myself more deeply through pain. The one thing David missed, the thing David overlooked while dividing up our assets, was me, the actual me. Not the wife, not the partner in a financial arrangement, but the woman underneath all of it. And that woman, I was worth more than everything David took combined. The rebuilding wasn't magical. It was methodical, one decision at a time. I went back to school for something I'd always wanted to study. I started writing seriously, not for money, but because my voice needed expression and my story needed to be told. I got a job that paid less money than before, but brought more meaning. I was helping people. I was building something real, not just accumulating. I moved out of my mother's house into a small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I'd earned it through my own work, my own effort, my own resilience. And slowly, I started to smile again. Not the smile from before, the one that was built on David's provision and David's stability, but a smile that came from inside me, a smile that belonged entirely to me. I realized that the house David took didn't matter. The money David took didn't matter. Not because I didn't need housing or income, I did, but because my worth, my actual value, had nothing to do with those things. My value was in me, in my ability to survive, to adapt, to learn, to grow, to become more myself through devastation. And that value couldn't be taken or divided or lost in a divorce settlement. A year later, I ran into David at a grocery store. David looked at me, and I could see David trying to understand how I was standing there peacefully while David had taken everything. David said, "I don't understand how you're okay." And I realized in that moment that David will never understand because David still thinks in terms of what can be taken: property, money, assets, things. David doesn't understand that the most valuable thing a person has cannot be taken. It can only be discovered. Here's what I know now. If everything was taken from you tomorrow, you would still have yourself, your capacity to survive, your ability to learn and adapt and rebuild, your resilience, your voice, your story. David took the house, but he couldn't take my home, the safe space I've created within myself. David took the money, but he couldn't take my ability to earn, to work, to provide for myself. David took the future I imagined, but he couldn't take my ability to imagine a different, better one. And me? I'm still here, still standing, still becoming. The woman I am now, stronger, more real, more honest, more myself, is worth more than every dollar David took, more than the house, more than the retirement accounts, more than all of it combined. I don't hate David anymore. I actually feel sorry for David, because David will spend his life acquiring things and never understanding what truly matters. And I've learned in the hardest way possible what actually has value. The one thing David missed while taking everything else was the real me. And the real me? I'm priceless. This is my story, not of loss, but of discovering what I was always worth.